Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished cleaning the marble floors of the penthouse suite. At 42 years old, she had been working as a housekeeper for wealthy families in Manhattan for over 15 years. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing, washing, and polishing, but her spirit remained unbroken despite the countless challenges life had thrown her way. The penthouse belonged to Alexander, a tech billionaire whose company had revolutionized cloud computing. At 38, he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. Maria had been cleaning his home for 3 years, arriving every Tuesday and Friday morning at exactly 7 o'clock. She was invisible to him, just another service provider who kept his life running smoothly while he focused on his empire. Maria's life had not always been this way. She had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador 20 years ago with dreams of providing her daughter Sophia with opportunities she never had. Sophia was now 22 and studying nursing at a community college. Maria had sacrificed everything to pay for her daughter's education, working multiple jobs and living in a tiny apartment in Queens. On this particular Friday morning in October, Maria's world was crumbling. She had received devastating news the day before. Sophia had been diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia that required immediate treatment. The medical bills would be astronomical, far beyond anything Maria could afford even with her modest health insurance. The doctors had given Sophia 6 months to live without treatment, but with proper care, she had a 90% chance of survival. Maria had spent the entire night crying and praying. She had called every family member, every friend, every charitable organization she could think of. She had applied for medical assistance programs, but the paperwork would take weeks to process, and Sophia needed to start treatment immediately. The hospital required a down payment of $50,000 before they would begin the specialized chemotherapy protocol. As Maria worked in the penthouse that morning, her mind raced with desperation. She had saved $12,000 over the years, but it was nowhere near enough. She had considered taking out loans, but with her income and credit history, no bank would approve her for such an amount. The weight of helplessness pressed down on her chest like a stone. Alexander sat in his home office, participating in a video conference with investors in Tokyo. His company was about to launch a new artificial intelligence platform that would generate billions in revenue. He was discussing profit margins and market penetration when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Through the glass walls of his office, he could see Maria working in the living room. Something was different about her today. Usually she moved with quiet efficiency, but this morning her movements seemed slower, more labored. He had never really paid attention to his housekeeping staff before. They were simply part of the background of his life, like the doorman or the building maintenance crew. The conference call ended, and Alexander walked to the kitchen to get his third coffee of the day. As he passed through the living room, he noticed that Maria was sitting on one of his white leather chairs, her head buried in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking, and he realized she was crying. Alexander had built his fortune by being analytical and emotionally detached. He approached problems with logic and viewed most human drama as unnecessary complications. His own upbringing had been privileged but emotionally cold. His parents had divorced when he was young, and he had been raised primarily by nannies and boarding school staff. He had learned early that emotional displays were signs of weakness. But something about seeing Maria in distress made him pause. Perhaps it was because she had always been so professional and composed in his presence. In 3 years, he had never seen her show any emotion at all. She simply appeared, completed her work with meticulous attention to detail, and disappeared without a word. "Is everything all right?" Alexander found himself asking, surprising himself with the question. Maria looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She quickly stood up and began apologizing profusely in her accented English. "I'm so sorry, mister. I shouldn't be sitting on your furniture. I'm having a difficult morning. I'll finish my work and leave right away." "Wait," Alexander said, holding up his hand. "What's wrong?" Maria hesitated. In all her years of working for wealthy families, she had learned to keep her personal problems to herself. Employers didn't want to hear about the struggles of their service staff. They wanted their homes cleaned efficiently and their lives undisturbed by the messy realities of the working class. But the kindness in Alexander's voice, unexpected as it was, broke down her defenses. The words came tumbling out in a mixture of English and Spanish, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter, Sophia, she's sick, very sick. The doctors say she has leukemia and needs treatment right away or she will die. But I don't have the money. The hospital wants $50,000 before they will help her. I've tried everything, mister. I've called everyone I know. I've applied for assistance, but they say it will take weeks, and Sophia doesn't have weeks." Maria fell to her knees, her pride crumbling under the weight of her desperation. "Please, sir, I know I have no right to ask, but I'm begging you. If you could lend me the money, I'll work for you for free for as long as it takes to pay it back. I'll clean your house every day. I'll do anything. Please don't let my baby die." Alexander stood frozen, completely unprepared for this moment. He had been asked for money countless times by charities, business associates, and distant relatives. But he had never been confronted with such raw, immediate human need. The woman kneeling on his Persian rug was not asking for a donation to a cause or seeking investment in a business venture. She was a mother begging for her child's life. $50,000 was nothing to Alexander. He spent more than that on a single business dinner. His watch was worth twice that amount. But as he looked down at Maria, he saw something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He saw a glimpse of a world he had never truly understood, a world where people worked themselves to exhaustion for wages that barely covered basic survival. Maria's hands were clasped together as she looked up at him with desperate hope. "I know you don't know me, mister. I'm just the woman who cleans your house. But Sophia is a good girl. She studies hard and wants to become a nurse to help people. She doesn't deserve to die because her mother is poor." The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like hours, but was only seconds. Alexander's mind raced through calculations and considerations. He thought about liability issues, about setting precedents, about the possibility of being taken advantage of. His business instincts warned him to politely decline and recommend that she seek help elsewhere. But something deeper than his business acumen was stirring. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother, who had struggled with depression and addiction after his parents' divorce. Perhaps it was the realization that despite all his wealth and success, he had never done anything that truly mattered to another human being. "Get up," Alexander said quietly. "Please stand up." Maria rose slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She prepared herself for rejection, for the polite but firm dismissal she expected from a man of his status. Instead, Alexander walked to his desk and pulled out his checkbook. "What's your daughter's name again?" "Sophia," Maria whispered, afraid to hope. "And which hospital?" "Mount Sinai. Doctor is the oncologist." Alexander wrote quickly, tore out the check, and handed it to Maria. She looked down at the piece of paper in her trembling hands and saw an amount that made her legs nearly give out from under her. It wasn't for $50,000. It was for $200,000. "This should cover the treatment and any additional expenses," Alexander said matter-of-factly, as if he had just handed her change for coffee. Maria stared at the check in disbelief. "Mister, this is too much. I can't accept this. I could never pay you back." "You're not going to pay me back," Alexander replied. "This isn't a loan. Consider it a grant. Take your daughter to the hospital today." The words hit Maria like a physical force. She began sobbing again, but this time with relief and gratitude so overwhelming she could barely breathe. She fell to her knees again, this time to thank him, but Alexander gently helped her stand. "There's a condition," he said, his voice becoming more formal. "I want to meet Sophia. I want to understand what this treatment involves, and I want regular updates on her progress." Maria nodded eagerly through her tears. "Yes, of course. Anything you want. Thank you, mister. Thank you so much. You've saved my daughter's life." After Maria left to rush to the hospital, Alexander stood alone in his penthouse, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. He had just made the largest charitable donation of his life, but it wasn't the money that unsettled him. It was the realization that in 38 years of existence, this was the first time he had directly and immediately impacted another person's life in a meaningful way. His phone rang with another business call, and he returned to his world of profit margins and market analysis. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in his life, Alexander had seen beyond his own carefully constructed bubble of wealth and privilege. That evening, as he sat in his empty penthouse eating takeout sushi, Alexander found himself thinking about Maria and Sophia. He wondered what their apartment looked like, what they talked about over dinner, what it felt like to love someone so much that you would kneel before a stranger and beg for their life. The next morning, Alexander did something he had never done before. He called the hospital and spoke directly with doctor about Sophia's case. He wanted to understand the medical details, the treatment timeline, and the prognosis. What he learned would soon change not just Sophia's life, but his own in ways he could never have imagined. The story of a billionaire's unexpected encounter with true human need had only just begun. What Alexander discovered about Sophia, about Maria, and ultimately about himself, would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, purpose, and what it truly meant to make a difference in the world. As Alexander hung up the phone after his conversation with Doctor, he made a D3 days after writing the check. Alexander found himself in the oncology ward of Mount Sinai Hospital, a place he never imagined he would visit voluntarily. The sterile corridors and antiseptic smell were a stark contrast to the luxurious environments he was accustomed to. He had told his assistant to clear his afternoon schedule, claiming he had an important meeting, which wasn't entirely untrue. Dr. Sophia's oncologist had agreed to meet with him after their phone conversation. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and the confident demeanor of someone who had dedicated her life to fighting a relentless enemy. As she led Alexander through the ward, she explained Sophia's condition in detail. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia in someone Sophia's age is quite treatable with the right protocol, Doctor explained as they walked. The treatment we've designed for her includes intensive chemotherapy, targeted therapy drugs, and possibly a bone marrow transplant if we can't achieve complete remission with the initial treatment. Your funding has made it possible for us to use the most advanced medications available. Alexander listened intently, surprised by his own interest in the medical details. In his business world, he was used to dealing with abstract numbers and theoretical markets. This was different. This was about cells and blood counts and a young woman's immune system fighting for her life. They stopped outside room 314. Through the window, Alexander could see Sophia for the first time. She was smaller than he had expected, with her mother's dark hair and eyes, but there was something about her posture, even lying in the hospital bed, that suggested strength. She was reading a thick textbook, and Maria was sitting beside her, holding her hand. Sophia insisted on continuing her nursing studies even from the hospital, Doctor said with a smile. She's quite remarkable. She's been asking detailed questions about her own treatment protocol and taking notes. I've never had a patient show such clinical interest in their own case. When they entered the room, Maria immediately stood up, her face lighting up with gratitude and nervousness. Mister, thank you so much for coming. Sophia, this is the man I told you about. Sophia closed her textbook and looked at Alexander with clear, intelligent eyes. She didn't look like someone who was dying. Her skin was pale from the treatment, and she had lost some weight, but her gaze was steady and alert. Thank you, mister, Sophia said, her voice stronger than Alexander had expected. My mother told me what you did. I want you to know that I don't take your generosity lightly. I plan to pay it forward someday. Alexander was struck by her directness. Most people, when confronted with his wealth, either became overly deferential or tried to impress him. Sophia spoke to him as an equal, with simple dignity and genuine gratitude. Tell me about your studies, Alexander said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. Sophia's eyes brightened. I'm studying to become a registered nurse, specializing in pediatric oncology. I want to work with children who have cancer, help them through treatment the way the nurses here are helping me. That seems like a difficult career choice, Alexander observed. It is, Sophia agreed. But I think sometimes the most important work is the hardest work. These nurses see people on the worst days of their lives, and they choose to show up anyway with compassion and expertise. That takes a special kind of courage. Alexander found himself drawn into conversation with Sophia about her studies, her goals, and her perspective on healthcare. She spoke passionately about healthcare inequality, about patients who couldn't afford treatment, about the emotional toll on families facing medical crises. Her insights were sophisticated and her commitment genuine. Maria watched the interaction with amazement. She had never seen her daughter speak so confidently with someone of Alexander's status, and she had certainly never seen a billionaire sit in a hospital room having an earnest conversation about nursing theory. "Sophia has always been special," Maria said quietly. "Even as a little girl, she would bandage her dolls and pretend to be their doctor. When other children wanted toys for Christmas, Sophia asked for books about medicine." Doctor returned to check on Sophia's afternoon medication, and Alexander observed the interaction between doctor and patient. Sophia asked detailed questions about drug interactions, side effects, and treatment protocols. She wasn't just a passive recipient of care. She was an active participant in her own healing. "Have you considered medical school?" Alexander asked Sophia as doctor finished her examination. Sophia exchanged a glance with her mother. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "But medical school is expensive, and my mother has already sacrificed so much for my nursing degree. I want to start working as soon as possible so I can take care of her for a change." Alexander felt something stir in his chest that he didn't immediately recognize. It was admiration mixed with something deeper. Here was a young woman facing a life-threatening illness, coming from a family with limited resources, yet she was thinking about how to serve others and care for her mother. Over the next 2 hours, Alexander learned more about Sophia and Maria's life than he had ever learned about any of the people who worked for him. He discovered that Maria sent money to her elderly mother in El Salvador every month. He learned that Sophia had graduated high school as valedictorian despite working part-time jobs to help with family expenses. He found out that they volunteered at a local food bank on weekends, despite having very little themselves. When Alexander finally left the hospital, his head was spinning with thoughts and emotions he couldn't quite process. He had entered the building thinking he was fulfilling an obligation, perhaps satisfying his curiosity about how his money was being used. Instead, he had encountered something that challenged his fundamental understanding of human nature and social responsibility. That evening, Alexander found himself researching medical school admission requirements, scholarship programs, and healthcare policy. He read about the shortage of doctors in communities, about the crushing debt that medical students faced, about the barriers that prevented talented students from disadvantaged backgrounds from pursuing medicine. For the next week, Alexander visited Sophia every other day. Each visit revealed new layers to her character and intelligence. She was studying for her nursing board exams from her hospital bed, maintaining a 4 GPA despite undergoing intensive chemotherapy. She helped other patients navigate the complex hospital system, translating for Spanish-speaking families and offering encouragement to frightened children. One afternoon, Alexander arrived to find Sophia in the children's wing, reading stories to young cancer patients. She was wearing a hospital gown and pulling an IV pole, but she was animated and joyful as she acted out voices for different characters. The children were laughing and clapping, temporarily forgetting their own pain. "She does this every day," Doctor told Alexander as they watched from the doorway. "The children's ward staff specifically requests her presence. She has a gift for connecting with people, especially kids who are scared and in pain." That night, Alexander made a series of phone calls that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He called the dean of Columbia Medical School, the director of the National Institutes of Health, and several prominent healthcare philanthropists. By morning, he had established a full scholarship fund for students like Sophia who wanted to pursue medicine but lacked the financial resources. But the scholarship fund was just the beginning. Alexander had started to see the healthcare system through Sophia's eyes, and what he saw appalled him. He learned about patients who rationed insulin because they couldn't afford it, about families who went bankrupt paying for cancer treatment, about emergency rooms overcrowded with people who had nowhere else to turn for basic medical care. 2 weeks into Sophia's treatment, her test results showed that the leukemia was responding better than expected to the therapy. Doctor was optimistic that Sophia would achieve complete remission without needing a bone marrow transplant. The news filled the room with relief and joy. "You're going to beat this," Alexander told Sophia, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "We're going to beat this," Sophia corrected him gently. "This wouldn't have been possible without you." That correction stayed with Alexander. For the first time in his life, he was part of a "we" that had nothing to do with business partnerships or financial gain. He was part of something that mattered in a way that transcended profit margins and market share. As Sophia's health improved, Alexander made an announcement that shocked his business associates and family. He was redirecting a significant portion of his wealth toward healthcare initiatives, starting with a comprehensive program to provide medical treatment for uninsured patients in communities. But the most surprising development came when Sophia, now in remission and preparing to complete her nursing degree, made an announcement of her own. She had been accepted to Columbia Medical School with a full scholarship from Alexander's newly established fund. However, she had a condition of her own. "I want to work with Mr. to design a new kind of medical practice," Sophia told her mother and doctor. "A practice that serves people regardless of their ability to pay, that focuses on prevention and community health, not just treating disease." Alexander, who had built his fortune by disrupting traditional technology markets, found himself energized by the possibility of disrupting the healthcare industry in a completely different way. Sophia's vision of compassionate, accessible healthcare aligned with his own growing understanding of how broken the current system was. The partnership that was forming between the billionaire and the young woman he had saved was about to become something much larger than either of them had imagined. Their combined passion for change was about to challenge one of the most entrenched industries in America. and the results would surprise everyone who 6 months later, Sophia Santos walked across the stage at Columbia Medical School, not as a graduate, but as the youngest student ever admitted to their accelerated MD program. Her remission was complete, her nursing degree was finished, and her partnership with Alexander had already begun transforming healthcare in ways that were making headlines across the country. The Santos Health Initiative had opened its first clinic in Queens, just 3 blocks from the tiny apartment where Maria still lived. The clinic operated on a revolutionary model. Patients paid what they could afford, from nothing to full price, based on their financial situation. No one was ever turned away, and no one ever received a medical bill they couldn't handle. Alexander had invested $20 million in the first clinic, but the real innovation wasn't the money, it was the approach. Sophia had designed a system that combined cutting-edge medical technology with community health workers who understood the cultural and economic barriers that kept people from seeking care. Traditional health care waits for people to get sick and then charges them enormous amounts to get well, Sophia explained to a reporter from the New York Times who was covering their 6-month anniversary. We focus on keeping people healthy in the first place, and when they do get sick, we treat them as human beings, not profit centers. The results had been remarkable. The clinic had treated over 3,000 patients in 6 months, with health outcomes that surpassed national averages and patient satisfaction scores that were off the charts. More importantly, emergency room visits in the surrounding community had dropped by 40%, as people finally had somewhere to go for preventive care and routine treatment. But success had brought unexpected challenges. Medical establishment leaders, pharmaceutical companies, and insurance executives were not pleased with the Santos model. They saw it as a threat to the multi-billion-dollar healthcare industry that depended on high prices and limited access. The first attack came in the form of a lawsuit from the New York Medical Society, claiming that the clinic was engaging in unfair competition by offering below-market pricing. Alexander's legal team easily defeated the lawsuit, but it was followed by a series of regulatory challenges, inspection campaigns, and bureaucratic obstacles clearly designed to shut down the operation. "They're scared," Sophia told Alexander during one of their weekly planning meetings in his penthouse, which had been converted into an informal headquarters for their health care initiative. "We're proving that their whole system is unnecessary. Of course they're going to fight back." Alexander was learning that disrupting healthcare was far more complex than disrupting technology markets. In tech, innovation was generally welcomed because it created new opportunities for everyone. In healthcare, innovation threatened entrenched interests that had spent decades building profitable systems around scarcity and complexity. The pressure intensified when Dr., the former head of the American Medical Association, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling the Santos clinics dangerous experiments that undermine the integrity of American medicine. She argued that healthcare required significant financial investment to maintain quality, and that charitable care models would inevitably lead to substandard treatment. Sophia's response, published in the same newspaper a week later, was devastating in its clarity and passion. She wrote about her own experience as a patient who nearly died because she couldn't afford treatment, about the nurses and doctors who had dedicated their lives to healing, but were trapped in a system that prioritized profit over patience. Doctor is defending a system that lets people die of treatable diseases because they can't afford medication, Sophia wrote. She calls our model dangerous, but what's dangerous is a system that forces families to choose between medical care and keeping their homes. What's dangerous is a system that trains brilliant, compassionate doctors and then forces them to spend 15 minutes per patient because they need to see enough people to pay for the administrative overhead of dealing with insurance companies. The op-ed went viral, shared millions of times on social media, and sparking a national conversation about healthcare reform. Sophia found herself invited to speak at medical conferences, policy forums, and television programs. At 23, she had become one of the most recognizable voices in the healthcare debate. Alexander watched Sophia's transformation with admiration and growing concern. The young woman who had been studying nursing textbooks in a hospital bed was now debating healthcare policy with senators and pharmaceutical executives on national television. She handled the pressure with grace and intelligence, but Alexander worried about the toll it was taking. "You don't have to carry this whole movement on your shoulders," he told her one evening as they reviewed plans for expanding to 5 more cities. "Yes, I do," Sophia replied simply. "Not because I'm the only one who can, but because I remember what it felt like to think I was going to die because my mother couldn't afford to save me. Every day we delay expanding this program, someone else is having that experience." The breakthrough came when Dr. James, the former Surgeon General of the United States, agreed to serve as the medical director of the Santos Initiative. His endorsement brought credibility that even their harshest critics couldn't dismiss. Within weeks, medical schools were developing curricula based on the community health model Sophia had pioneered. More importantly, other wealthy individuals began following Alexander's lead. Tech entrepreneur Sarah committed $50 million to open Santos clinics in California. Real estate magnate David funded a network of clinics in Texas and Florida. What had started as one billionaire's charitable impulse had become a national movement. Maria Santos watched her daughter's transformation with pride and amazement. The shy nursing student who had been fighting for her life a year earlier was now addressing the World Health Organization about sustainable healthcare models for developing countries. But Maria also worried that Sophia was forgetting to be young, that she was carrying responsibilities that should be shared by entire institutions. Maria said one evening as Sophia prepared for another television interview, "You don't have to save the whole world." "I'm not trying to save the whole world, Mama," Sophia replied, adjusting her professional blazer. "I'm just trying to make sure that other mothers don't have to beg strangers to save their children's lives." The comment stung Alexander, though he knew Sophia didn't mean it that way. He had come to understand that his initial act of charity, which he had considered generous, was actually a symptom of the very system they were now fighting to change. Sophia shouldn't have needed to rely on his individual kindness. She should have had access to health care as a basic human right. The one-year anniversary of Sophia's diagnosis was marked not with sadness, but with celebration. The Santos Initiative had opened clinics in 15 cities, treated over 50,000 patients, and inspired similar programs across the country. Medical schools were reporting record applications from students interested in community health. The model was being studied and replicated internationally. But the most meaningful moment came during a quiet dinner at Maria's apartment, the same tiny kitchen where mother and daughter had cried together over Sophia's diagnosis. Alexander had been invited to join them for a traditional meal that Maria had prepared. "You know what the strangest thing is?" Sophia said as they shared and talked about the future. "A year ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was getting cancer. Now I realize that getting cancer led to the most important work of my life." "Getting cancer didn't lead to this work," Alexander said quietly. "Your character led to this work. The cancer just gave you a platform to show the world who you already were." Maria reached across the table and took both their hands. "My daughter was always going to help people," she said. "And Alex, you were always going to find a way to make a real difference. You just needed to meet each other." Alexander had insisted that Maria call him by his first name months earlier, after she had continued calling him Mr., despite everything they had been through together. The formality had started to feel ridiculous, given that he now considered both women family. As the evening wound down, Sophia made an announcement that surprised both Maria and Alexander. She had been accepted to a fellowship at the Centers for Disease Control, where she would spend 2 years developing policy recommendations for community-based healthcare systems. "I'll still be involved with the initiative," she assured Alexander, "but I think we've proven that this model works. Now we need to change policy so that it becomes the standard, not the exception." Alexander felt a mixture of pride and loss. Sophia was moving beyond their partnership toward even greater impact, which was exactly what should happen. But he would miss working with her directly, miss her insights and her moral clarity that had guided so much of his transformation over the past year. The final surprise came the next morning, when Alexander received a call from the White House. The president wanted to meet with him and Sophia about incorporating the Santos model into a national health care initiative. Their local experiment in compassionate care had caught the attention of the highest levels of government. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the Rose Garden as the president signed the Community Health Care Access Act, legislation that would provide federal funding for community health centers based on the Santos model in areas across the country. Sophia stood beside him, no longer the desperate patient in a hospital bed, but a respected healthcare policy expert whose vision was reshaping American medicine. Maria was there too, wearing the dress she had bought for Sophia's high school graduation, tears of pride streaming down her face. The bill wasn't perfect, and the implementation would face challenges, but it represented something unprecedented. a fundamental shift toward viewing healthcare as a human right rather than a luxury good. The movement that had started with a mother's desperate plea and a billionaire's unexpected compassion had grown into a national transformation. As they walked out of the White House together, Alexander reflected on how completely his life had changed. A year and a half earlier, he had been a successful but isolated man whose greatest achievement was accumulating wealth. Now he was part of something much larger than himself, something that would outlast any individual success or failure. "What's next?" Alexander asked Sophia as they shared a taxi back to the airport. "Everything," Sophia replied with the same confident smile she had worn as a sick young woman planning her future from a hospital bed. "We've shown that a different kind of health care is possible. Now we have to make sure it becomes inevitable." The story that had begun with a desperate plea in a Manhattan penthouse had become a revolution that changed American healthcare forever. But for Alexander and Sophia Santos, it was never really about changing a system. It was about remembering that behind every policy decision, every medical bill, every insurance claim, there were real people with real families who deserved to be treated with dignity and compassion. The billionaire who had once been moved by a mother's tears had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars accumulated, but in lives transformed. And the young woman who had faced death with courage had discovered that surviving wasn't enough. The real challenge was using that survival to ensure others didn't have to face the same desperate choices her family had confronted. Their partnership had saved Sophia's life, but in the end, it had saved something much more important. It had restored faith in the possibility that privilege and compassion could work together to create a more just world for everyone. Thought they understood what was possible when privilege and purpose joined forces with genuine human need. What neither of them realized was that their collaboration would soon attract attention from powerful people who had a vested interest in keeping the healthcare system exactly as it was. The real test of their partnership was still to come that would set in motion events none of them could have predicted. He was about to discover that sometimes helping one person can reveal truths about yourself that you never knew existed.